In the winter of 1942, while most shipyard workers rushed through their shifts to meet impossible deadlines, one welder moved slower than the rest. Her name was Eleanor Ellie Watkins, a 23-year-old who had never seen the ocean before the war. She had come from a Maryland farm where metal work meant fixing tractors and grain hoppers, but within weeks of training, she found herself with a torch in hand, staring at the steel ribs of a Liberty ship rising into the grey sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Speed was everything. Welders were told not to overthink, not to adjust, not to experiment. Every seam had to follow the standardized pattern, the one the engineers had approved under crushing production pressure. The inspectors didn't want creativity, they wanted uniform lines and finished quotas. A Liberty ship needed to be built in weeks, not months, and any deviation from the welding manual was considered an illegal seam. But Ellie couldn't forget the way steel behaved when it bent, twisted, or took a sudden impact. She had spent her childhood watching metal fail and learning how to make it strong again. So when she welded the forward bulkhead of hull 213, she did something she technically wasn't allowed to do. She added a hidden secondary bead, a tiny reinforcing line tucked under the main seam. It wasn't listed in the manual. It wasn't inspected. And if anyone had noticed, she would have been written up, maybe even suspended. She told no one. It was only a few inches long, no wider than a pencil. Just a small insurance policy for a ship she would never sail on. Hull 213 launched quietly and joined a convoy headed for the icy Atlantic. Ellie had already moved on to the next hull, and the next after that, welding the way she was supposed to, except for those little additions she kept making whenever something in her gut told her the metal needed help. Months later, on a moonless night off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat fired 3 torpedoes into the convoy. The Liberty ship that took the first hit was Hull 213. The explosion tore open the bow, buckling plates the size of truck beds. The ship should have cracked in half. Thousands of tons of seawater should have rushed in. But something strange happened. The hull flexed, groaned like a wounded animal, and then held. The second torpedo struck amidships. Men were thrown off their feet, steam lines ruptured, and the engine room filled with smoke. But the ship didn't break. It listed hard to port, but the keel refused to snap. The third torpedo never detonated, lodging itself in a twisted section of hull where the plates had folded but not fractured. Later, divers would confirm the impossible. The stress that should have split the ship had been redirected. A small, reinforcing weld no longer. Then a hand had stopped a crack from travelling through the forward bulkhead. That tiny seam forced the blast energy to disperse around the hull instead of slicing it open. The Germans who boarded captured survivors were baffled. They had seen Liberty ships sink from single hits. They had watched them break apart from winter storms. But this one had survived 2 detonations and remained afloat long enough for a rescue destroyer to take her in tow. In the after-action report, US engineers argued about what had happened. Some blamed luck. Some blamed an unexploded warhead. Only one investigator found the unusual weld pattern, the illegal seam, hidden under the approved one. He wrote a note in the margin. Unknown welder added reinforcement. Possibly prevented catastrophic crack propagation. No one ever traced it back to Ellie. She welded hundreds of seams before the war ended, each one under pressure, each one a stitch in a steel fleet that kept Britain alive. She never knew that her tiny act of defiance had saved a ship, a crew, and a convoy. She never knew that German officers had stood over the wreckage of Hull 213, astonished that a cheap American cargo ship had withstood their best torpedoes. And she certainly never knew that the seam she wasn't supposed to make, the one no one inspected, The one she added because she cared too much had changed the fate of men she would never meet. The Liberty ship that Ellie helped weld limped into Belfast under tow, battered, sagging, its bow plates warped like melted tin. Harbour crews and Navy inspectors swarmed around it, whispering about how no cargo ship should have still been afloat after taking the hits it had. The Irish dock workers, used to seeing the mangled corpses of torpedoed freighters, gathered on the quayside just to watch her come in. To them, she looked like a ghost ship, a vessel that should have died twice on the open sea yet refused to sink. But the ship had stayed, alive just long enough for the destroyer escort to latch on and drag her towards safety. It was a miracle, some said. Others called it stubbornness. And although no one realized it yet, a small welded line no longer than a hand had silently done the work of an entire armor belt. The surviving crew were taken ashore for medical checks and debriefings. They were exhausted, shaken, and still covered in soot and oil. Many could barely speak from the shock of surviving what should have been a textbook sinking. They told the same story again and again. First blast forward, second blast amidships, and a third impact they thought was the end, followed by confusion when the ship shook but did not tear apart. None of them knew about Ellie. None of them knew they owed their lives to someone who had never seen their faces. While the crew recuperated, the ship underwent emergency stabilization so engineers could climb inside. They spent hours photographing blast patterns, tracing crack lines, marking stress fractures, and examining every area where the hull had buckled but not failed. Some of the metal was torn, some scorched, some twisted like a pretzel, but they were stunned to find huge sections still intact, especially in the forward compartment. The ship's chief naval architect, Lieutenant Warren Hendricks, was summoned from London. He was a quiet, methodical engineer in his 30s, known for his stern expression and refusal to accept convenient explanations. When he arrived in Belfast, he didn't go to the officers' club or even check into his quarters. He walked straight to the dry dock and stood under the massive keel, staring up at the wounded giant in utter disbelief. "This shouldn't be standing," he muttered to the dockmaster. "Yet it is," the dockmaster replied, tapping the hull with the back of a wrench as if to confirm it was real. Hendricks climbed into the interior compartments, ducking under hanging cables and stepping over debris. He ran, his hands along warped metal, studying the ripple effects created by the explosions. It didn't add up. A Liberty ship was designed to survive. One torpedo hit maybe, but never two. Definitely not three. When he reached the forward bulkhead, the sight of the first explosion, he froze. Something about the infection-like spread of stress lines struck him as odd. The crack propagation was interrupted halfway down the plate by an unexpected reinforcement. A secondary bead, thin and neat, tucked beneath the official seam. He leaned in close, wiped off the soot with his sleeve, and blinked. The seam wasn't part of the official shipyard specifications. It wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't standard. In fact, it was against regulations. "Who the hell put you here?" he whispered to the silent steel. His assistant, Petty Officer Whitlow, climbed in behind him. "Sir? Find something?" Hendricks pointed to the bead. "That seam isn't supposed to be here. It redistributed the blast load. Without it, this whole section would have sheared off." He stepped back, staring at it like a detective who had just found a clue that solved half the mystery. Whoever welded this saved the ship. While Hendricks was unraveling the secret in Belfast, the shipyard in Baltimore was operating at a frantic pace. Ellie Watkins was still moving from hull to hull, torch in hand, goggles fogged, gloves stiff with salt from long days near the sea air. She didn't notice the inspectors passing by, nor the foreman yelling about quotas, nor the clatter of cranes dropping prefabricated sections into place. She only saw the seams, the lines where steel met steel, where strength was born, or where failure hid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her co-workers liked her, even admired her skill, but they joked that she welded with the intensity of a surgeon, repairing a heart. Some said she cared too much. Others said caring too much was a luxury nobody had during wartime. But Ellie kept adding her small, illegal reinforcements whenever the plates felt wrong, whenever a joint vibrated too much under stress, or whenever she sensed the structural geometry needed help. She never did it out of defiance. She did it because she wanted the ships to come home. She never expected anyone to notice. Weeks after her reinforced ship limped into Belfast, Hendricks arrived in Baltimore without warning. He carried a thick binder of reports, blast diagrams, and photographs of hull fractures. He marched straight into the shipyard office, demanded access to welder logs, and then spent an entire afternoon reviewing names, shifts, and initials stamped on the steel plates. He found Ellie's mark on the forward bulkhead, EW17. He frowned. He had expected an older man, someone with decades of experience, maybe a senior welder brought out of retirement. He certainly hadn't expected a young woman in her early 20s. Hendricks arranged a meeting. Ellie was welding in a cramped space between bulkheads when the foreman's voice echoed through the compartment. "Watkins, drop the torch and report to the office. Navy inspector wants a word." She climbed out, wiped her face, and straightened her protective jacket. She assumed she was in trouble, that someone had finally noticed her unauthorized techniques. She mentally prepared herself for a reprimand or dismissal. As she walked into the office, Hendricks stood with his arms crossed, studying her like an engineer assessing a new machine. "You're Eleanor Watkins," he said. "Yes, sir," she answered, unsure if she should salute, stand at attention, or run. "Sit," he said. She did. He pulled out a photograph, a grainy black and white image of a warped bulkhead from hull 213. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. "No, sir," she replied. "I weld a lot of ships." "You welded this seam." He tapped the reinforcement on the picture. "It's not part of the approved pattern. In fact, it violates shipyard regulations." Ellie swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "Why did you do it?" She hesitated. "Because the joint was wrong. It was vibrating more than it should, and the stress lines weren't matching. The metal needed a secondary bead to stabilize it. I just didn't want it failing at sea." Hendricks stared at her. She waited for the punishment. Finally, he said, "This weld redirected the blast load of a torpedo, then another, then prevented a third explosion from tearing the ship in half." Ellie blinked. "What?" "You saved a Liberty ship," Hendricks said, "and you saved the men on board." She leaned back in the chair, her breath catching in her throat. It didn't seem possible. She had just been doing what felt right. The idea that a small, hidden bead had altered the fate of dozens of sailors and confused the German Navy felt unreal. Hendricks continued, "I want you transferred." Her heart dropped. "Transferred, sir?" "To the inspection and reinforcement team." He closed the binder. "Your instincts are better than half the engineers I've worked with. We need welders who understand stress behavior, not just quotas." Her hands trembled slightly. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." Ellie's transfer wasn't welcomed by everyone. Some shipyard supervisors resented the attention she was receiving. Others questioned why a woman, and a young one at that, was suddenly advising foremen and engineers. But Hendricks backed her completely, and his word carried weight far beyond the shipyard gates. She began reviewing hulls before welding teams touched them, marking areas where reinforcements were necessary. She trained dozens of welders in what she called behavior welding, watching how the metal reacted, how it expanded, how the vibrations hinted at hidden weaknesses. It wasn't theoretical. It was a craft, a blend of intuition and experience she had honed on her father's farm long before she wore a Navy-issued badge. Her reinforced techniques spread quietly through the yard. Welders started to add small beads of their own when conditions felt wrong. Supervisors initially complained, but after a series of stress tests showed stronger results, the yard quietly adjusted its unofficial guidelines. Ellie never took credit. She didn't want it. She only wanted the ships to make it across the ocean. Meanwhile, reports from the Navy told stories of Liberty ships surviving blasts that should have destroyed them. German U-boat commanders wrote bewildered notes in their logs. Hit did not break the ship in two. Cargo vessel refused to sink, and American construction appears unusually resilient. No one connected the dots. But Hendricks did. Years passed, and the war drew closer to its end. Liberty ships continued to cross the Atlantic, some lost, many surviving, and a surprising number returning home battered but afloat. Ellie's contributions were never formally recognized, lost in the endless paperwork and politics of wartime production. To the Navy, Liberty ships were statistics. To the Germans, they were targets. To the world, they were symbols of American industry. To Ellie, they were living things she stitched together, hoping they held long enough for sailors to reach port. After the war, she returned to Maryland, bought a small workshop, and welded farm equipment again, the quiet life she always wanted. She never expected to hear anything more about Hull 213, but one afternoon, nearly a decade later, a letter arrived. It was from a former crewman, a machinist named Thomas Avery. He wrote about the night the Torpedoes struck, about how they thought they were dead, about how they survived long enough for rescue because some welder back home cared enough to do the job right. He didn't know her name. He only knew the Navy had traced the reinforcing seam back to a young female welder in Baltimore. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," he wrote, "but whoever you are, thank you. You didn't just save a ship. You saved fathers, brothers, sons. You changed lives without knowing our faces." Ellie sat alone at her kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. She thought of the long days at the shipyard, the rushed welds, the hidden beads she left like secret signatures. She remembered thinking no one would ever notice. But someone had, and their lives had depended on it. Outside, the wind rattled the workshop windows, and for the first time since the war, Ellie allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done, the quiet heroism no medal could capture, no headline would ever record. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small box with her goggles and welding gloves. She had saved a ship. She had saved men she would never meet. And the Germans, staring in disbelief at a Liberty ship that refused to die, never understood that it wasn't American steel or American factories that had defeated them that night. It was a single, illegal seam made by a welder who cared too much. Ellie didn't notice at first, but the war had started to live inside her. It was in the way she walked home from the shipyard with her shoulders still tense, as if expecting steel plates to shift above her. It was in the way she slept lightly, waking to the echo of distant hammer strikes, ghost-like in the early hours before dawn. It was in the way she measured every object, railings, porch steps, even the seams in her father's old tractor, always checking angles, imagining where metal might bend or fail. The war changed her in ways she never told anyone. She wasn't the type to share feelings, and she certainly wasn't the type to make herself the center of attention. Her work was supposed to be invisible anyway. Welders didn't get medals. Welders didn't get named in dispatches. Welders didn't get remembered. But her hands remembered everything. Her gloves always smelled faintly of carbon, even after washing. When she closed her eyes at night, She saw sparks drifting through the dim cavern of a half-formed hull, tiny stars falling in slow motion. She had welded hundreds of seams by now, thousands maybe, her torch guiding molten metal into place until the joints fused with a quiet hiss that felt almost intimate. Each weld was a promise. This part will hold. This part will protect. She didn't know that across the ocean, men on the deck of Hull 213 had touched those promises with trembling fingers as the ship creaked beneath them, refusing to break even as seawater poured through shattered compartments. She didn't know that her name had been spoken in confusion by German engineers studying the buckled wreckage. She didn't know that the Navy's metallurgical inspectors had argued about her, hidden reinforcement until tempers flared and pencils snapped. History rarely tells the welders what part they played, but history hadn't forgotten Ellie. Not yet. The days grew longer as spring approached Baltimore, but war production didn't slow. Ellie's crew was assigned to the night shift for 3 weeks, straight, long, cold hours under floodlights that made the steel look like ghostly bones rising from mud. The wind off the harbour carried the smell of diesel, salt, and hot metal, a mixture she had learned to associate with urgency. "Shift change in 10, someone shouted as she stepped onto the scaffolding. Her friend Benjamin Huck Houston leaned over the rail of the catwalk, helmet pushed back, cigarette glowing like a firefly between his fingers. "You hear about the brass inspection tomorrow?" he asked. Ellie shook her head as she strapped on her welder's mask. "Is it because of Hull 274? "Maybe," Huck said. "They're saying the hull plates didn't line up clean. Someone thinks the warping might be from temperature drops." She snorted. "Or from management cutting heat to save on coal." Huck gave a crooked grin. "Ellie, you're going to end up in trouble one of these days. You talk too much truth," she smirked as she lowered her mask. "Good thing you talk enough nonsense for both of us." They worked in rhythm, the comforting kind that came from months of trust. Huck knew exactly when she needed him to steady a plate or slide a wedge into place. She knew exactly when he needed a few seconds of pause because his wrist had started aching again. The two of them had welded so many hulls together that she sometimes forgot they hadn't known each other before the war. The torch lit with a roar, cutting through the night. Metal sparked and hissed. Her world shrank to that narrow line between what was weak and what could be strong again. She was almost finished with the seam when she felt it an instinctive, tightening in her chest. Something about the plate's vibration wasn't right. The tension in the metal was uneven, which meant stress distribution might be unpredictable under load. She lifted the torch slightly, angling it toward the underside of the seam. Huck noticed immediately. "Ellie," he muttered through his mask, "that looks like one of your extras." She didn't deny it. "Plates off balance," she said quietly. "Could crack under torsion. Manual says leave it." "I'm not leaving it," he sighed. "If the inspectors catch—" "They won't." The torch flared again. Just a few seconds. Just a hidden bead. Just enough to change the metal's future without anyone noticing. Huck shook his head, but he didn't stop her. He'd come to trust her instincts more than the manual, too. 2 days later, the inspection began. The senior naval metallurgist arrived with a clipboard, a stiff hat, and a reputation for making grown men cry. He barked orders as he moved from hull to hull, scraping metal with his stylus, checking welds with a magnifier, tapping plates with a small hammer to listen for inconsistencies. When he reached Ellie's section, her pulse jumped. Huck shot her a look, half warning, half sympathy. The inspector ran his stylus slowly along one of her seams. Consistent width, proper overlap, acceptable bead height. Then he paused. Ellie stopped breathing. It was a small pause, but enough to make her fingers tremble inside her gloves. "Minor variation," he said finally, "but within tolerance." He moved on. Huck let out a breath through his teeth, sounding like a balloon deflating. See? We're fine. You worry too much. She had promised herself she would stop adding illegal reinforcements after what happened with Hull 213, and technically she had, but sometimes the metal told her what it needed. Ignoring it felt like ignoring a cry for help. She didn't know that the inspector had made a note, not a reprimand, more of a curiosity. He was the same man who had studied the impossible survival of Hull 213. He recognized certain patterns in the welds here. He didn't say a word, but he wondered. That night, Huck walked her home along the darkened streets. The blackout rules meant no street lamps, no bright windows, just silhouettes, and the distant hum of factories working non-stop. "Ellie," he said suddenly, kicking a stray pebble. "What made you start welding?" She shrugged. "Farm life. Someone had to fix the broken stuff. My father wasn't much good at it." Huck chuckled. "Same story everywhere, I guess. My old man said real work was in the fields, not the workshop. Funny how the workshop's what got me through the depression." They walked another few steps. "You ever think of signing up?" Huck asked quietly. "For the military?" He nodded. Ellie laughed softly. "They'd put me behind a desk. You could drive trucks, or be a mechanic, or—" "Huck," she interrupted gently. "I'm where I need to be." He seemed to understand. Welders didn't fit easily anywhere else. They built things quietly, kept their heads down, and trusted their hands more than their words. They reached her building a drafty third-floor apartment with peeling paint and loose railings she kept meaning to fix. Huck hesitated at the bottom of the steps. "You're one of the best welders I've ever seen," he said. "Maybe the best." "That's a low bar. I'm serious." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She wasn't used to compliments. She wasn't used to being seen. "Good night, Huck," she whispered. He nodded and walked away, shoulders hunched against the cold, hands shoved deep in his pockets. A week later, the telegram arrived. Not for Ellie. For Huck. She found him sitting on a crate beside the dock, the paper crushed in his fist. His face looked like it had aged 10 years in an hour. "My brother's ship," he said. "Went down in the North Atlantic. U-boat attack." Ellie sat beside him in stunned silence. "I don't even know which Liberty ship it was," he whispered. "It could have been one we worked on. It could have been one with a bad weld, a weak seam." "Huck," she said firmly, "you are not responsible for that." He didn't answer. The harbour wind carried the distant clang of steel plates. The sky darkened above them. Huck stared at the water for a long, long time. That night, he didn't walk her home. The next morning, he didn't show up for work. And the day after that, he turned in his resignation. When Ellie found him packing his locker, she felt something cold settle inside her. "You're joining up," she said quietly. "Gunner's school," he replied. "Atlantic Fleet." "Huck, that ocean eats ships. It eats people." He gave a small, tired smile. "Then maybe I'll bite back. Don't do this because of guilt." He paused long enough that she realized he was doing it because of guilt. "I have to try," he said. "Somebody's got to." Her throat closed. She wanted to say so many things. "Don't go. You're needed here. I can't weld without you." But none of them came out. So instead she reached into her pocket, pulled out her spare welding rod, and pressed it into his palm. "For luck," she said. He held it as if it were something sacred. "Write to me?" he asked. "When I can." "When I can," she echoed. But the truth was, she wasn't sure either of them would have time. War was speeding up again. Spring turned to summer. Production quotas doubled. Ellie's crew shrank as more men enlisted. New welders joined, nervous, inexperienced, sloppy. Ellie spent more time fixing others' work than advancing her own. Her foreman noticed. "You're picking up everyone's slack," he warned. "They need training. They get training. Doesn't mean you have to babysit." She didn't argue. But she didn't stop either. If a hull went to sea with a bad weld, she would never forgive herself. Sometimes she thought of Huck riding a convoy escort, scanning the horizon for periscopes. She imagined him gripping the welding rod she had given him, tucked into a pocket of his life vest. She imagined him standing on a pitching deck, the Atlantic roaring around him, the sky swallowing all sound. She imagined him surviving. She received his first letter 3 weeks later. It was clumsy, folded unevenly, smudged with grease. Ellie. "They put me on a 5-inch gun crew. The waves are bigger than the ship. I already threw up twice. Don't tell anyone." She laughed aloud when she read it. But the second letter was shorter. "We lost a tanker yesterday. We fired everything we had. Didn't matter." After that, his letters came less often. She wrote back, telling him stories from the yard, drawing small diagrams of welds, describing ships like living creatures, how they groaned, how they flexed, how they struggled to stay whole. She wanted to send him courage, or comfort, or something stronger than both, but she never knew if her letters reached him. Sometimes she dreamed she was building a hull around him piece by piece, welding steel plates into a cradle so strong that no torpedo could touch him. One humid night, the yard foreman shouted, "All hands! Emergency meeting now!" The workers gathered in the open space between slipways 4 and 5. A senior officer stood on a wooden crate, boots shining under the floodlights. "Men and women," he began. "We have a situation in the North Atlantic. Several Liberty ships have broken apart in heavy seas. Investigations suggest structural failures along longitudinal seams." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. He continued, "We need immediate reinforcement protocols. All welders will be briefed." She barely heard the rest. Ships breaking in half, longitudinal seams. Was it the steel, the design, the cold? Or was it the welders, too rushed, too tired, too undertrained? Her stomach twisted. What if she had missed something? What if Huck was out there right now, depending on a hull she had helped build? After the meeting, she walked the edge of the shipyard alone. The clang of metal echoed through the dark as if the ships themselves were crying out. The ocean was winning again, and she felt powerless. 2 days later, the metallurgist returned, the same one who had inspected her weld earlier, the same one who had studied hull 213. He approached her during a break, adjusting his glasses. "You're Watkins, correct?" She nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir. I've reviewed several of your weld patterns. They show unorthodox methods." Her chest tightened. "If you want me fired, just say so." He raised an eyebrow. "Fired? Miss Watkins, I'm recommending you for an advisory role." Her confusion must have been obvious because he clarified. "You understand stress distribution intuitively, better than some of our engineers." Ellie stared at him, stunned. "We need welders who see the ship as a whole, not just straight lines in a manual. We need people like you." She didn't know how to respond. Praise wasn't something she trusted easily. "Before I submit the paperwork," he said, "I have one question. How did you know to reinforce that plate on hull 213? Her heart skipped. She hadn't known anyone noticed. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I just felt it." He nodded slowly, as if confirming a theory. "There will be ships saved because of how you weld," he said quietly. Then he walked away. She stared after him, unsure whether she felt proud or exposed. She didn't get a chance to tell Huck any of this. No letter came for weeks, then a month, then 2. Her stomach grew hollow. War didn't need permission to steal people. It didn't need fairness or reason. One evening, a naval officer approached her on the scaffolding. "Watkins?" he asked. Her throat clenched. "Yes?" He handed her a sealed envelope. "It's from a destroyer captain," he said. "Something about a gunner's mate who insisted this be delivered to you if anything happened." Ellie's hands shook as she broke the seal. The letter inside was written in Huck's handwriting, but the ink was shaky, as if written during a storm. "Ellie, if you're reading this, something went wrong." Her breath hitched. "I've been meaning to tell you something. Not about the war. About you. You made me believe I was still good at something. You made me want to try harder. You made me care." Her vision blurred. "If I don't make it home, please don't stop welding the way you do. It saved men I'll never meet. It might save me too. Huck." She pressed the paper to her chest and let herself cry for the first time since the war began. But there was another note inside, written by the destroyer captain himself. "Your friend is alive. Injured, but alive. His convoy was hit. He's being transported home for recovery. He clung to a piece of hull plating that stayed intact when the rest of the ship sank. He said it reminded him of your welding." Ellie collapsed onto the scaffolding rail, sobbing with relief. Huck was alive. Her weld held. Her work mattered. When she returned to her station, the torch felt lighter in her hands. She wasn't just welding steel anymore. She was welding hope. She was welding futures. She was welding the thin line between life and death. Every bead, every seam, every spark was a promise. And when the next Liberty ship slid into the water, gleaming under the morning sun, she laid her palm against its warm hull and whispered something she'd never said aloud before. "Hold together. Hold for them. Hold for all of us." The war wasn't over, but neither was she. And history, though it didn't know her name, would carry the strength of her hands across every ocean the ships dared to cross. The rain started before dawn, a soft mist rolling in from the harbour that blurred the shipyard lights into pale halos. Ellie arrived early, long before her shift, because sleep had deserted her again. Not nightmares, just restlessness, a heavy sense that something in the world was changing, and she needed to be moving to keep up with it. Word had spread fast. Huck was coming home. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The letters from the destroyer captain had stopped, replaced by short, impersonal notes from the naval hospital in Portsmouth. Condition stable. Ongoing recovery. Nothing more. But it was enough. Enough to let her breathe again, without feeling the sharp edges of fear. Enough to let her work without imagining the worst. She walked along the quiet dock, the sea shifting under a washed-out sky. A half-completed hull towered above her. Ribs, exposed like the skeleton of some enormous whale. She loved ships at this stage when they were vulnerable, when their metal bones reached upward with both strength and fragility. Once the plates closed in, a ship became a mystery, its hidden spaces sealed away forever. But now, with the frame laid bare, Ellie could read it like a map. She climbed the scaffolding slowly, letting her hand trail along a curved beam. The steel felt cold, almost anxious. She could always tell when a hull wasn't balanced properly. It carried tension like a creature about to bolt. She reached the top and crouched beside the seam she had been studying. Her torch lay beside her boot, but she didn't pick it up yet. Instead, she watched the rain droplets gather on the metal before rolling down in thin lines. The hull groaned softly in the wind. "You're not ready," she murmured. She didn't know why she talked to ships. Maybe because her father never listened, and metal always did. Or maybe because ships were the only things in her life that needed her without pretending otherwise. Footsteps clanged up behind her. Thought I'd find you here, a familiar voice said. She turned to see the metallurgist hat soaked, glasses fogged, coat dripping like he'd run through the rain from the administration building. You should be indoors, Ellie said. And miss watching you commune with steel? He replied sarcastically. She smiled, despite herself. He adjusted his glasses and glanced over the hull. They're rerouting a convoy strategy. Command is pushing for faster build times again. Ellie exhaled heavily. Faster builds meant more errors, more risks, more men depending on welds that barely held together. They'll break ships if they keep rushing us, she said. They'll lose the war if they don't, he replied bluntly. She knew he was right. The U-boats were still prowling the Atlantic like wolves. Every day, another Liberty ship was needed sometimes, to bring supplies, sometimes to bring the wounded, sometimes to bring home bodies. How's your advisory review going? He asked. Ellie shrugged. I didn't apply. You don't apply. You get chosen. I'm a welder, she insisted. You're more than that, he said. You see structural weaknesses before they happen. You see what others miss. She traced a fingertip along the edge of the metal. I belong here. You belong where you can save the most ships, he corrected. She didn't answer. She didn't know what she wanted. Not yet. He started to leave, but paused. You'll have to decide soon. Then he descended the scaffolding, leaving her alone with the rain and the quiet hum of metal. Ellie stayed until the shift whistle blew. Inside the welding bay, the heat hit her like a furnace. Sparks flew from dozens of torches, lighting up the dim interior. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, some laughing, some cursing, some lost in the rhythm of the flame. Ellie joined her station, pulled on her gloves, and let the noise settle around her like a familiar blanket. She had just ignited her torch when someone tapped her shoulder. Watkins, the foreman called. Telegram for you. Her stomach dropped. She removed her mask slowly, as if afraid the world would collapse the moment she moved too fast. The foreman handed her the envelope and stepped away discreetly. Ellie stared at the folded paper. Her hands felt suddenly clumsy, her breath unsteady. She tore it open. Patient transferred to Baltimore Naval Hospital. Arrival within 48 hours. Just that. No name, no details. But she knew. Huck was coming home. Her knees softened, and she found herself leaning against a steel beam. Workers nearby barely noticed everyone was exhausted. Everyone leaned on something eventually. For a moment she let herself imagine it. Huck on a stretcher being rolled off a transport ship. Huck smiling through pain. Huck holding the welding rod she gave him. He was alive. Alive. She folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her chest pocket. Then she picked up her torch with steadier hands. Work felt different now. Not lighter, never lighter, but more purposeful. Every seam she welded, every bead she laid down, felt like a promise fulfilled. Ships carried people, and people carried each other. 2 days later, she stood outside the naval hospital, palms sweating inside her gloves. She hadn't even changed from her work overalls. Maybe she should have, but she hadn't wanted to waste a second. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and damp wool blankets. Nurses hurried past with clipboards. The building hummed with the tense quiet of a place constantly waiting for bad news. When she reached the ward door marked "Recovery Non-Critical," she froze. What if he didn't remember her? What if the war had changed him? What if he blamed her somehow? What if the door opened from the inside? A nurse stepped out, startled. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Ellie swallowed. "Benjamin Huston. I'm a friend." The nurse's expression softened. "He's awake. I'll take you to him." Her heart hammered so loudly she could barely hear anything else. They walked past rows of beds, some filled, some empty, some separated by curtains where soft murmurs and quiet weeping came from behind the walls of cloth. When they reached the last bed near the window, Ellie saw him. Huck lay propped against pillows, a bandage around his left shoulder, bruises along his jaw, one arm in a sling. He looked thin, too thin, like the ocean had carved pieces out of him. But when he turned and saw her, his smile was unmistakable. "Ellie," he whispered, voice rough but warm. Her breath broke. She approached slowly, afraid she might suddenly wake up. "You look terrible," she said, trying to sound normal. He laughed quietly. "You should see the other guy. I imagine the ocean looks worse." "It does," he said. "But you should know. That piece of hull I held. It didn't crack." She sat beside him, gripping the bed rail because her hands trembled too much. "You held on," she murmured. "I had to," he replied. "Someone was waiting for me." Her face flushed. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but full of things neither had words for yet. Finally, he said, "I kept the welding rod." "I hoped you did." "I kept every letter, too." She looked down, throat tight. I thought you might not come back." "I did too," he admitted softly. "But I kept seeing your welds in my head. The way you made steel behave. The way you fight for every inch of strength." He exhaled shakily. "I thought, if Ellie could make a ship hold together, maybe I could too." She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "You're going to heal," she said. "And then? And then? We figure it out." He smiled faintly. "Together?" She nodded. For the first time since the war began, hope didn't feel fragile. It felt welded strong, reinforced, something that could bend without breaking. Outside the hospital window, the harbour glistened under the fading light. A Liberty ship's horn echoed in the distance, deep and resonant, like a heartbeat. Ellie closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Ships carried people, and sometimes, if the welds were strong enough, people found their way back to each other. She reached out, hesitated only a moment, and gently took Huck's hand. His fingers curled around hers instantly. For now, that was enough. More than enough. And somewhere in the shipyard, a half-built hull waited for her return, waiting to become something strong, something meant to endure, something she would pour her whole heart into again. Because the war wasn't over. But neither was hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.